All right, we are going to have Leslie Drane anchor our morning session from archaeologist. Leslie is a PhD candidate at Indiana University in Bloomington. She started her studies in anthropology and women and gender studies at the U of I in Champaign, and she moved on to the Indiana University for her master's in anthropology and is now working on her PhD work, and some of her PhD work she's doing on our Wapello Land and Water Reserve. Leslie, I asked her just a little while ago how she got connected with us, because I didn't know, frankly, the story, although I've spoken with her a number of times. And she couldn't trace it exactly either, but she knows it came through talking with Dr. Phil Milhouse and thinking about studying specific pottery. She'll maybe talk a little bit more about this, but somehow circuitively, if that's the right word. So anyways, she made herself to this area, and we're just thrilled to have her here with us and to share the work that she's doing out at the Wapello Land and Water Reserve. So please join me in welcoming Leslie Drane.
Thank you. All right, is this on? Great, okay. So if you weren't here for Phil's talk earlier, he said he's a pacer. I'm also a pacer. I usually teach and I just walk around with students to make sure they're not on Facebook or anything like that. So I'll try to stay near the podium today. But thank you all so much for being here today. Oh my goodness. So I am used to giving talks at universities where it's considered amazing if 10 people show up and you feel really excited about it. So I need to start telling all my academic friends that they need to give talks in Northwestern Illinois if they actually want to talk to an audience, because this is pretty amazing. So thank you for being here. A special thank you also to JDCF, Friends of Wapello, and everyone else who helped put this event on today. It obviously took a ton of work, and I'm very honored to be here. All right, so I don't even know where to start. There's already been so much good material in this morning. I would like to echo what Steve started with this morning by acknowledging the traditional ancestral territory that we are on today of the Ho-Chunk in Wisconsin, the Lakota and Dakota Sioux in Wisconsin, Minnesota and the Dakotas, the Sac and Fox and the Meskwaki tribes of Oklahoma and Iowa, and any other people who may trace their heritage to this region. I think it's important that we acknowledge the land and those who were forcibly removed from it and are continued to deny access to it, right? Because if we don't, voice those things, it's easier to continue to deny rights to those people. And as you'll see today, my research is focusing on communities and landscapes. So I deem it really important for us to remember the histories of those landscapes, those that are positive and those that are very negative, right? All right. So, and I also want to say, I have a note to back up Phil's point earlier. You might have been here. Phil talked a lot about how anthropologists talk about culture a lot, and we, talk about these regions of people, and we give them names like Woodland and Mississippian, right? And Phil was really great in reminding us those are names that a lot of archaeologists, anthropologists have given to people to help us when we're in conversations to each other. But I want to highlight that those aren't static people, right? Like maybe most of us don't think of us only as people from Northwestern Illinois, right? We think of us as parents, we think of us as community members, sisters, daughters, things like that, right? So our identities, they're multiple. So please keep that in mind why I am also, saying Woodland or Mississippian people, that these aren't just static groups, okay? All right. Cool, so what I will be talking about today is I'm going to be talking about my research focus a little bit more, talk about what I'm interested in, hopefully it's interesting to all of you. Then I'm going to talk about the John Chapman site, which is on that Wapello Land and Water Reserve. You might be more familiar with it under that name. And then I'm talking about two areas of data. So I use magnetometry data, which y'all just got a glimpse of, right? And then I also am going to talk about a little bit of ethnographic data. So that's when I'm talking to present-day people about, their interest in the site and why they continue to protect it, visit it. All right. So just so we're all on the same page, so with my current research, I not only focus on the past, but I try to bring in those contemporary peoples as well. And I'm interested in how people relate to places, and specifically this site at Wapello, the John Chapman site. And so I examine the possible roles of landscapes and materials in creating communities with humans. So my research situates people, materials, and lands all working with one another, right? So we often think about, past land is very human-focused, right? We're just, people did this to the land, right? We don't necessarily always consider, but what does the land bring to the way we understand ourselves? How does land, change our day-to-day actions, our interactions with people? How can materials do the same thing? So I study 2 time periods, that of the past and the present, to try and better understand the people who lived and are currently working with the John Chapman site. So you can see I analyze how archaeological materials and landscapes changed when those Mississippian influences around Cahokia, as people were talking about earlier, interacted with people at the John Chapman site. And I interview contemporary people who work at, volunteer, visit, or maybe just have knowledge of this site, as to try to understand if those people in the present feel some type of community with this land, or maybe even those of the past. All right, cool. So again, just to make clear, my research questions are, so what do we actually see in the landscape, in the materials, when people from down south are coming up north? Are there any changes in the way, people construct their houses, their pottery, anything like that? So what can we infer from this, right? So archaeologists are all about telling stories. We don't want to just show you pictures and move on, but what maybe arguments could we make, what inferences could we make about these possible changes? And lastly, how does that interaction with contemporary people of the John Chapman site tell us a little bit more about the land and those communities that result from it? All right. So, to start off, I want to explain some of these terms that I might be using today because as an anthropologist, I'm very used to sometimes using this jargon and having people look back to me with blank faces because I realize I actually haven't started at the beginning and explained myself. So I'm trying to explain a little bit more today. So you might hear me using these words like spaces and places. A lot of us, myself included, when we're talking day to day, we'll use these as synonyms and use them interchangeably, right? But as anthropologists, like everything, we've given a very specific definitions and meanings to these words. So when we talk about space, we are talking about this usually understood as more abstract. So it has no meaning. It's this area that we don't have any emotional connections to, nothing like that, okay? And places are these areas that are special to us, that we have meaning, right? So this gym, this is considered a place for all of us, right? Because we've all gathered here today, we're all having a similar experience. You might be having emotions, maybe a little boredom as this girl keeps talking on and on at you, hopefully not. And it's very much based on human experience, right? So it's this idea that humans are the ones who give meaning to places. And this is an important thing. So it's based on the idea that the world is really this clean slate that doesn't have meaning until humans come along and give it meaning, okay? So what's the problem with that? Why do some people not like these definitions? Some people argue it's really human-centered, right? It's very much focused on, hi, I'm here, I give this meaning. It doesn't have meaning without me, right? Say, isn't it a little self-centered to think that a place only has meaning because of humans? You might agree, you might disagree. Some argue that spaces are made out of places, so kind of flipping what is, that every place has meaning, and then some places develop to have less meaning. Okay, So how do we give meaning to places? Again, just trying to explain the way I'm using these words, and this will all be pretty familiar to you just as citizens of the world, okay? So we do it through things like vision, smelling, hearing, taste, through symbols and art. So someone asked earlier if there's any written language that we know of from the people we're studying today. There's no written language, but that doesn't mean that they don't communicate, right? Through symbols, through different meanings like that. Through experience, a big one, like all of us gathering here today. But I want us to think places are not just set things, right? So people have been talking about the archaeology site a lot, that it's, we don't know everything that happened there, and multiple things happened there, right? So even though we're looking at a moment in time, we have to think that, it continues to change throughout time. And it will continue as archaeology gets better and we have different meanings and understandings of it. So here are just some pictures to illuminate that. At the top, there's a couple natural disasters, the 9/11 memorial. So think because of things that have happened, we have a different understanding of that place than we did before, right? This is very appropriate, I think. Here's a picture of a high school, right? When you were in high school, that place meant a lot of things to you, right? Could be a place of anxiety, could be a place of great fun. But now most of us, when we walk back into a high school, it doesn't really hold those emotions anymore. We're just like, where's the bathroom? Where's the free coffee? Okay, I'm good, right? So places are personal. So I grew up in Stockton, Illinois, not very far from here. This is a very personal place to me. It's where I have breakfast with my family almost every time I come back. But to some people, they may never have had the joy of Stella, so this place doesn't mean anything to them, right? So it's all very independent. And we also mark places with things. So places, we give meaning to them. So again, I'm going really heavy into the high school examples here, right? So you all might have done this growing up, you might have kids who do this, but we often decorate our places, right? I don't think anyone here can say they've ever left their house completely as it was when they walked in, right? We decorate it with furniture, in this example, decorating our lockers to show personalities. You might be lucky enough to have an office space that you can decorate. Hopefully you don't go this far, but we decorate our places. We give them personal meaning. And so there are artifacts of places. So I also study ceramics. I won't be talking about that today. And some people ask me, well, what does that really have to do with places or landscapes? That's something they made, not necessarily where they lived. And I can definitely see that argument. But I also argue that, well, every material we have has a context of someplace, right? You use it someplace. So here are just some examples of artifacts of places. So, cave drawings, our highway systems are artifacts of places. Giant rocks similar to Woodhenge, and even some little tchotchkes or whatever you might have in your house are some artifacts of place. Going on, we also have emotions of places. You can think of weddings as a great example, so that changes the way you might feel about a location. And so going back to this argument, we're talking a lot about how humans, right, can change places based on their emotions, their experiences. But I want us to think about today, can places like the John Chapman site, Wapello Land and Water Reserve, have power, have meaning without us humans having to experience it, right? Is there just something innately about landscapes? All right, so I'm also going to be talking about communities. This is something I talked a little bit about at the beginning when I asked you, do you only think of yourself as a person from Northwestern Illinois? Probably not, right? So communities are lived, I argue. So they're not just, what we say. So I'm not just a daughter because I say it. It's also based on my experiences, right? I hang out with my family. I sometimes do stuff around the house to help. My mom's here, so I can't lie too much. Things like that. It's our experiences with others that make those relationships and identities more alive. Communities lack boundaries. What does this mean? So what that means is we don't all have to be in the same physical space to be in a community, right? So think of, many of us may identify as Americans, right? You are still an American if you go to Mexico, right? You're still an American if you go to Italy. You don't have to be in the physical bounded space for that identity to stay true. Right? And so the last point is, I say they're continually under negotiation. So what does that mean? Basically, the way we identify, the communities we identify with, change throughout time. Right? So I had that example of high school. Many of us probably did identify as a high schooler at one point. Now, thankfully, I no longer identify as a high schooler, right? So that's a community I was a part of, one that I'm no longer in, okay? So I want us to keep these things in mind as we're going forward, and I'm, sometimes incorrectly using big words like woodland people, Mississippian people, but I often talk about them, as bounded people, but I want us to think about them in this regard. So they're not just Mississippian people because they made these certain types of pots, right? They're also Mississippian people because they had religious association with these pots. They mostly talked with Mississippian people. They did these ceremonies that made them Mississippian, things like that. They may have, slowly became Oneota people because they changed their outlooks and ways on the world. So people aren't bounded, but rather change throughout time. All right, let's go into this case study and I'll take a sip of water. All right, so taking all these big ideas of spaces, places, communities, and I'm trying to unpack them at a place called the John Chapman site, which y'all have already seen a little bit today. As you know, it's owned by JDCF and managed as a public park, so if you haven't, after lunch, you can hop on over there. And it was occupied approximately 1100 to 1150. Those are the people that I'm looking at. Of course, it was people were there before, people were there after, right? By a culture known as the late woodland people. And 300 miles south of the John Chapman site is the archaeological site of Cahokia, which people have also been talking about quite a bit today. And around 1050, people from Cahokia, it seems, were going up to this area to the John Chapman site. And so we know this from past archaeological excavations that Phil Millhouse was a part of, that it seems like Mississippian people migrated and were living alongside those late woodland people. So at the John Chapman site, we see a community in transition, right? We see this new identity, new communities being considered for these people. All right, so as Phil mentioned a little bit, the bulk of this research was conducted at the John Chapman site, was from a University of Illinois field school that resulted in his dissertation about the site. And this is my public thank you to Phil Millhouse for being such an amazing scholar and friend and for helping me out so much in sharing that knowledge. It's so much appreciated. All right, so since I'm talking about two areas, Cahokia near modern-day St. Louis and John Chapman in Hanover, I want to make sure I'm giving some background on both areas. So around AD 1050 is when Cahokia was really at its prime. So about 15 to 20,000 people were there. And it was around this time that, again, they began traveling to the John Chapman site. All right, so Cahokia. Has anyone been to Cahokia from a show of hands? Awesome, okay, so should I just pick one of you randomly to give the talk about Cahokia? No. All right, so it's near modern-day St. Louis and Collinsville, Illinois, so please forgive me for those who know all this information. But it's known best for its 100 feet tall Monk's Mountain, which you can see there. Also another show of hands, has everyone climbed it who's been there? Okay, so if you have made the trek to the top, you know how impressive it is that people made this, right? Not with any, man, you can tell I'm not involved with farm work at all because I can't even think of the words. Not with any type of big machinery, but with their own technology, right? Using hoes, using baskets, making this huge mound. It's amazing. So it's the largest man-made mound in the North American continent, so it's quite an impressive feat. But there were people there before this, right? So around 8700, woodland people began to establish the Cahokia area, and throughout the generations, they began to establish a new way of living. So they had a heavier dependence on corn, new pottery styles, new way of building their houses, organizing their neighborhoods, things like that. All right. So I'm briefly going to walk us through the chronology of Cahokia. It's very interesting. So Mississippians are known for being highly stratified in a quite heavily agricultural community. And it was at, yes, I have the right slide, yes. It's at 1050, something archaeologists called the Big Bang, right? We're trying to make it as interesting as we can. So, unlike a lot of cities, Cahokia got big really quick. I mean, 15 to 20,000 people is amazing. You know, I came from a town of 1900, so when I think about a city that big, it's very impressive. And it was around this time, a little bit after, around 1100 to 1200, that was known as, you know, the golden age of Cahokia. So that's when, you know, everything was going good for them. There was a lot of people prospering, a lot of people in kind of what we can imagine as suburbs. A lot of people were living here. They had wood henges, which Dr. Horsley mentioned earlier, their type of calendars. And this is likely when it was this big, you know, influx of people, a big time period, that these people were moving up north. And we don't necessarily know why they were doing that, right? We have our guesses. Some people argue that they were similar to missionaries, right? That they wanted to say, hey, we have this really cool religious movement happening down here. We want to get more people involved, so moving up. Some people argue that, you know, they may have been people who didn't like what was going on at Cahokia. As Dr. Millhouse mentioned, we've been arguing with each other forever. So to pretend that there were no arguments in the past is foolish, right? So there could have been people who just, you know, were like, I don't really like what's going on here, so I want to go somewhere new. Right? We don't necessarily know the reason, but it doesn't seem like there were any violence between the Mississippian and woodland people. All right, so people start, you know, gathering, but also some move away at this time. And then in the next few years, so around 1175, some palisade walls go up at Cahokia. So you can see they were trying to keep, you know, their best places covered. So we see Monk's Mound, that huge mound that I was talking about. We see that big plaza, and we see 17 other mounds, you know, being included in this palisade area. So again, we don't necessarily know the exact reasons. This is all inferences, our best guesses, but there were guard towers. You can see in that drawing what those might have looked like. So it you know, sort of indicates that it was defensive. So maybe they were worried about some outsiders getting to, you know, their main place. Shortly after, about 25 years later, we see a steadily decline in population, and then it's pretty much abandoned by the 1300s until later Oneota people come. All right, so y'all with me? That was in St. Louis, that was down south. All right, so what's actually going on up north at the same time period? So you might remember, this is the woodland people, effigy mound culture, so around, you know, 600 to 900, 1000. So these people were living in smaller egalitarian groups that would often travel to make use of the annual resources. And so while older ancestors of the tribe would maybe have made conical mounds, people started moving towards effigy mounds, an example of which you can see here today. So these were people in southern and western Wisconsin, in parts of Illinois, Iowa, and Minnesota that were doing this. All right, so changing mounds was not the only exciting thing. So pottery began to experiment. They made grit-tempered pottery. And you can see that they would wrap paddles and cords and hit that on the side to make a new type of pottery that wasn't seen as much. And probably the most exciting thing, I don't have a picture up here, was we don't see those large projectile points anymore. We see those smaller points around those period. Does anyone know why? Yeah, exactly. So the bow and arrow, right, became popular at this time, and it spread quick. It was like the iPhone, right? It was the newest technology. Everyone had to have one. It was very quick spreading. So people at this time, late woodland, don't always get the best rap in archaeology circles, because they're sandwiched between Hopewell and Mississippi, and so people are like, oh, those are boring. But there was so much innovation happening at this time that we really have to think of it as, a crazy, exciting time where people are really changing the way they do agriculture, changing the way they hunt, which then changed, the way that they live. We see more year-round settlements happening rather than continually moving. All right. Cool, okay. So just to back up a little bit and give I've been talking about the Mississippians and woodland people, late woodland people. So this is how archaeologists often classify them. Remember that we are mostly looking at people's garbage, right? So what does that garbage tell us? So with late woodland people, we usually see smaller structures than we see in Mississippi. They get bigger. They use post-hole techniques, which what that means, if I was a woodland person, classically, I would, dig a little post hole and put, a small tree or cedar branch in there and then later fill it with daub. Well, with Mississippians, you can see in that picture there, would use wall trench structures. So they would dig out these basins that Dr. Horsley was talking about and then, build whole walls on the ground and then flip them into those wall trenches. So we can see a different structure style happening. We also see a lot of differences in the ceramics. So again, very, very broadly, ignoring all that stuff I said about communities earlier, if we were to slowly categorize, we would say woodland people usually do grit tempered pottery. What temper means is basically additions that you add to the clay to help with the firing process. So grit is little pieces of rock, right? And then they would do this, paddle marking thing called cord marking. And with Mississippians, we usually see shell tempered. So different technologies, just different way of doing things. All right, so again, just a reminder of our research questions is really trying to figure out, so what are the differences between these people and what can that tell us about, how they understood themselves and maybe how they were using the landscape. All right, so 2003, University of Illinois excavations, 0.5 hectares in that northern portion of the site. You can see it with that arrow there. Milhouse concluded in his dissertation that the intermixing of ideas and practices from both woodland and Mississippian people resulted in a culture that we usually call Oneota today. So Oneota people were improving the agricultural methods in order to feed their families, trading and communicating across new regions until the arrival of the Europeans. Milhouse did call for more work to be done, so here I came. I jumped on that opportunity. I was like, okay, I'll do it. Here I am. To figure out the rest of the site, because as many people were talking about, excavations are amazing for so many reasons, but they take a lot of time and money. So we get a small snapshot of the site. So almost every archaeology talk you'll go to, you'll hear a person say, and more research needs to be done, hoping that there might be a millionaire in the crowd that wants to fund that. So I decided to investigate with magnetometry. So as you heard, magnetometry is what we call non-invasive, but Dr. Horsley brings up some really good points of questioning whether or not it is that non-invasive methodology that uses the Earth's natural magnetizing field and magnetic variations caused by both human and natural occurrences. It allows us to use that data to look at perhaps those human-made anomalies. So in simpler terms, it allows us to see underground, right? See those subsurface features without excavating. All right, I debated whether or not I should include this, so if it's really boring, just close your eyes for a second. All right, so I just wanted to explain, because when I've given this presentation similar to this before, a lot of people ask, I still don't get how magnetometry works, and I go, me either, but I can offer at least a little bit. Right? So as we all know, there's not just dirt all the way into the earth. We also have some exciting things going on. A solid inner core made of predominantly iron and a liquid outer core made of mostly nickel iron. You can see that in the picture there. And that's how it creates these electric currents, creating those magnetic fields. We're all aware of the magnetic pole of the Earth and magnetic variations that can exist. So magnetic variations can very much happen in natural ways, natural fires, bacteria, as Dr. Horsley was talking about, will have different magnetic susceptibilities, but it can also be caused by humans, right? And that's what we're looking at when we do this type of work. So some common ways are human-created fire, right? Whether to just keep warm, to cook, to create materials. So organic materials like food and waste being stored together in high amounts in a pit or basin. And then also removing or adding topsoil. So when you move around the dirt and maybe take more magnetic susceptible stuff, put it over here, we can see that sometimes in magnetometry surveys. All right, so this is a picture of me doing the survey, wondering, what am I doing? You know, because when you're out there, you don't get to see the picture, so you're just really hoping that you picked a good area and it's all going to turn out great. But, so you can see the gradiometer that I'm using. It looks like plastic. No one understands why it costs so much. It's a big mystery to us. But so basically, it kind of takes two measurements and calculates the difference. We walk in a very systematic way so that we can later put it on the computer. So in October 2015, I conducted a preliminary survey at the site to test the methodologies and see, how magnetometry did at the site, because as Dr. Horsley mentioned, it's not always appropriate for every site. So you can see the area that I worked at circled here. So I collected data from 9 30 by 30 meters grid, covering an area of, 8,100 meters square. Yep. So the reason I chose this is, so you can see that's bead mount here. So the excavations were like up there, right? So previously, a lot of the excavations and focus had been on the north, where those University of Illinois excavations were. But when they did walkover surveys, they also found large concentrations to the south. So I wanted to check out were those large concentrations also maybe structures, pits that they found in the north. All right, so we're doing a close focus. So in this image, we can see some of the results. So please note the lines running diagonally. So are plowing from modern farmers. So if anyone had any doubt whether or not there was really farming, I'm here to confirm it for you. It seems like there was. So those anomalies we discussed earlier, by fire or gathering of garbage, things like that, show up as darker images. So things like this here. My circles don't show up the best, but hopefully I can point them out for you. So it seems like there's mostly pits, things that are discarded in them, or house basins. So you can see some of the house basins outlined in the square and some of the pits outlined by circles. So this is more likely to be a house basin here, here, while these are more likely to be pits. Right. There's also an area in the middle demonstrated by the arrow here. That points to a square type of anomaly that could potentially be a mound, although it would be a large one at approximately 30 meters by 15 meters. So while walking this area, we did take note that there was a slight rise in the middle/north survey area that could possibly be a mound. And those who grew up in the area and were familiar with the land said, it used to be littered with mounds. So this is possibly one, but keep in mind this magnetometry data is not alone enough to make those arguments. But can everyone see what I'm talking about? This little kind of white outline there? Maybe a huge structure, but. All right, so I came back in October 2016, and I ended up doing more survey that gave us a total area of 46,800 meters squared. And you can see I collected the data from two distinct areas. So this is that square that I had done earlier. So you can see I went up to the north because I was interested in also seeing what was around this bead mound, and down to the south where there had been heavy materials during walkover surveys. so just zooming in, because it's kind of hard to see when it's all zoomed out like that. Let's look at some of the southern stuff. So, as Dr. Horsley mentioned, so these are likely metal, right? When you see that really stark black against that really stark white, that's more proof that farmers were probably there, right? And that, they lost a couple things while they were farming. So we're not as interested in these, very good to know, but more interested in what happened before the contemporary farmers were there. So let's look at the whole survey again. So looking at a couple areas, there are a lot of pits showing up. It's a little hard to see with some of that plow lines there. So the lower circle to the west shows an area that's likely natural anomalies. And Dr. Horsley has detected similar findings as he talked about in the Whalen edition, right? So that's when ground would kind of freeze and unfreeze, and we'd see the soil material being sorted by size. So when you see that kind of, little crazy waves over there, that's probably actually natural. In the northeast area, we see an area with relatively few anomalies. So anomalies being those dark areas again. So you can see up here, there's relatively few things. So this could possibly be a plaza. Some people have hypothesized that there might be one next to the mound. It is difficult to know without having that surrounding area what it could be, but we at least can see that there appears to have been relatively little activity going on there, activity that left data that magnetometry could detect. All right, so magnetometry is helpful because it can help us reconceptualize the manners in which people used the site and moved about it. So it allows us to see, maybe how they set up their community. It allows us to better see how they would have actually physically moved about the site and how that would have created different interactions. So in that data, let's see if I can go back. We don't see a ton of house basins, which you might remember are how Mississippians constructed their houses. That's not to say they're not there, right? They could definitely be there, but kind of masked under a lot of the pits or a lot of the plowing that was done. Or it could be that mostly woodland people were there and didn't, do those basins. They did those whole structures that we talked about. All right, so switching gears a little bit. Remember when I told you I actually talked to people as well, which is sadly rare for archaeologists. I'm also interested in not how only past people use the site, but why are so many people still interested in this site today? Or maybe not interested in it. Right? So I'm going to briefly talk about some of the conversations I've been having with contemporary populations. And a lot of this grew out of my studies. So I've been lucky to talk to many scholars who are pushing for something called community archaeology, public archaeology. It's pretty much shaking archaeologists and being like, you've got to talk to people. You can't just stay in the lab, right? So trying to, share what we're studying and also get an understanding of what people know, because a lot of us aren't like Phil Millhouse and have been walking around these sites since we were a little kid. And it's mostly the local people who have all the knowledge that they can share with us. So I have been doing this work, let me go back, and trying to understand, what people understand when they go to the site. So why do they want to help protect the site? What are they interested in regards to archaeology? And I found some interesting things. A lot of connection with understanding the land as holding knowledge, but also understanding these artifacts and lands as associations with family members. So again, going back to that type of community that we were talking about. So I just have a couple of quotes that I pulled from the conversations I've been having with people that I found really special and wanted to share with y'all today. All right, so this first one. So my background and interest, talking about archaeology, has stemmed from my childhood. My father died when I was very young, and the only connection I had to him and my family on that side was a few artifacts. So I think this is really special because it shows, a lot of us draw these connections with people when, we're looking at these materials and when we're going to these sites. It's not just this static thing in the past, but it can cause us to reflect on the relationships that we have today. Another person talked about family in a little bit of a different way. So they were talking about, I asked them, why are you doing this work? Why are you not hanging out, reading on the back porch, when you're doing this bloody, difficult work? And this person said, I went out there in the first days, and we were taking out invasives, and I was actually taking care of the land. And that it was like being a mom again, like when my kids were little. I'm taking care. Even picking up garbage on the road, it doesn't matter. It's the taking care of it. It's not mine, but I'm taking care of it. It's the caretaking that draws me to the other people that are caretakers of that land. Right? This person's actually reflecting on their role and what they're doing at the site. It reminds them of a very special role that they played as a mother. So again, those associations with family. And a lot of people talked about just feeling that the land holds memory or knowledge. So going back again to the idea of place and questioning, do places only matter because we're humans and we say they do, or do places affect us too, right? So this person says they were going out to the site and they can just imagine it as a very significant place. Maybe it's something like that, maybe I feel some connection to that in just a human sense. It's really questioning, again, what it means to be human and talking about the memories and knowledge that place holds. Just a few more. Okay, so this person is talking about the experience of actually holding some materials, which I'm sure we've all felt, walking fields and you find an object. And I learned about the people, seeing those pieces helped me relate to their lives. So it was very powerful, and my interest continued. And I also had some really interesting experiences out in those preserves, things that I couldn't quite articulate, or may not really have words for us to explain. And our last one, talking about these places and saying they're all linked to memories and stories, Seeing a place in stills, it kicks off all these associations, and they're locked, and they kick off emotions and stuff. It's all stuff that our culture is uncomfortable with. And this person went on to talk about, their experiences in the city and when they're not actually, connected with natural landscapes, how they feel, rather disconnect from those emotions and places. So, I want to bring up these experiences because I think it's important for us to not only talk about in the past, but consider how our present day people interacting with the site. Why do they find it valuable to be here? What are these places that we're at? Do they hold meaning? Do we all experience them in the same way? Probably not, right? So I'm arguing that these places, these materials, these memories aren't just static things that humans come in and we make all the decisions, but they also have an impact on us, how we understand one another. So through magnetometry, through ethnography, how can we better understand how these sites were used and what that might mean to the communities that were there before us? So just simplified, knowledge and history are built into these places, right? So they're not just static places, they have long histories and continue to have histories as we're all here today talking about them. All right, so with that, I'm gonna end it there and say thank you so much to all of those people who have helped me, all the generous people who have said, sure, I'll talk to you, given me an hour of their time. And thank you all so much for being here today and for listening. Thank you. I don't know if there are any questions or if we're all eager to go to lunch. I will totally understand that. Hi, yeah.
So you get your information from going to places and also from books?
Yeah, good question. So, yes, I do. I mean, there are tons of archaeologists who've done, some great work. So I do reference those materials. I do try to have conversations with those people. So for example, that's how I became interested in looking at this site. I was interested in some ceramics called Ramian-sized pottery, which some people might be familiar with. It's very decorative, very unique pottery that Mississippians made. And I was trying to see, where was that all over the Midwest? And there was a kid who wrote this for his senior thesis at University of Illinois about Ramian-sized pottery at when he was an undergrad, and I started reading about that, and he mentioned the John Chapman site, and I was like, oh, that's where I grew up. Oh my gosh, cool, I want to learn more about that. And so yeah, my interest in it absolutely did come from reading other people's work. So I do go there as well, like I did with the magnetometry survey, but you know, I do want to acknowledge that a lot of people have done amazing work, and I don't want to discredit that by ignoring it. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
I'm wondering, your oral histories of why and how people related to the community and sites like Macomb, what are some of the implications of what you learned in terms of the effect of public education stirring up that sense of place?
Absolutely, great question. So in case you couldn't hear, he asked, so you're doing this work, so what are some of the ramifications that can come from this ethnography work? How can it be used? Great question. If you have any suggestions how it could be used, I would love to hear it. But
Well, you said you grew up in Stockton.
yes.
What was the dynamic in going to school in Stockton that made it possible for you to give this lecture today?
Absolutely. So all jokes aside, I do think it is really important to talk to present day people and to try to understand what are their interests. So for too long, archaeologists have said, this is what I find interesting, so this is what everyone else is going to find interesting, right? And that's not, I don't think, the best way to go about it, and to try to find out why people are preserving these landscapes. Maybe people are preserving it because they only care about the natural landscapes. That's fair. Like, how can I have a conversation with them, learn from them, you know, try to figure out what's important to them so that we can both reach our ultimate goal of preserving the site. So personally, yes, I do believe that it's me growing up, you know, in Stockton and around these areas that make them special for me. You know, not only that I do get to visit my family more when I do research here, that's special to me, but also, you know, I'm interested in my own family history, so thinking about, you know, the history of landscapes throughout time, how many people have been here is personally interesting to me as well. I don't know if that answered your question, I hope it did. Any other questions? Yeah, hi.
The Hopia site, what time, let's say, what year do you know that the Europeans discovered it?
The Cahokia site, exactly. What year do we know the Europeans discovered it? I'm not sure about that. It was around 1300 that the Mississippians kind of went away until the Oneota came, and they were there with until European expansion and colonization. Does anyone else know that in the crowd? The exact year that Europeans came to Cahokia? I'm looking over at this corner. Yeah. So your guess is early 1700s? That's our best guess. I'm sorry?
Any of the early settlers, take interest in like urban drawings of it? What are they about?
Yes, I think people have always been very interested in this place. I don't have any examples of European drawings or like that, but a lot of us do find sites and evidence of these sites from lesser places than Cahokia because people and explorers did these drawings before they were ruined by modern day farming. Did you have something to add?
Spanish didn't get that far north. It was French first got there, and Cahokia is a French name.
Awesome. Okay, so French first got there, not Spanish. Thank you so much.
Did you climb up any of those mountains? Did you show?
I have only climbed Monk's Mound, which is the only one that has steps so that you're encouraged to climb. Otherwise, I prefer to just leave them be and not climb them. Yeah. And I'm not that fit, too. It was a struggle for Cahokia's or Monk's Mound. Any other
There's
questions?
a question about when Cahokia was discovered. That was about 1670.
1670. The French came over. I'm so glad.
They went through the valley, you know, the south.
Uh-huh.
And then Hannington, you know, wrote about this book.
Awesome.
But the Mississippi Valley was around 1670, or a little before 1660.
Cool. So more accurate dates. 1660, 1670. I love this crowdsourcing of information. Y'all are great. Yeah.
Yeah, just an observation and then a question. When I think about this, you know, I've been to Cahokia, and it is an amazing place. And about these interactions, here, and now, here comes somebody up the river, which, you know, it was this tremendous highway where, and people with a totally different culture, a different language, I'm sure. And, you know, we think about these meetings of culture like Columbus coming to Hanover, and yet these were taking place all the time here, long before you did the contact. And we think about this, you know, we're so great, there's different cultures, some meeting is a primitive one. But I think the meeting of the Mississippi Valley culture and the Lake Woodland probably was almost as profound as the difference between Columbus and the native areas and the question I have for you, though, is that, you know, in studying the Mississippi Valley culture, I've heard some suggestions that perhaps the Mandarins were actually a last relative of kind of that Mississippi Valley culture. Their culture was quite different from everybody else around them. Have you read anything about that?
Can you repeat that last question?
So the Mandan Indians, you know, they lived in North Dakota, but their culture was totally different from the Dakota that surrounded them. And I've heard it suggested that they made them the last relative of the Mississippi Valley.
Yeah, two great points. So your first one, thank you for pointing out, I'm not sure if everyone could hear it, but talking about how, you know, intense that must have been to have Mississippians come up and introduce this new way of life. And I'm glad you bring that up because I think it can be very problematic that we sometimes think of indigenous people in the past and present as, you know, very monolithic and just like one, but, you know, there's tons of variation, different cultures, and that's something to definitely give acknowledgement to. As your question about like what contemporary cultures you know, claim heritage to maybe this region or down in Cahokia, my research doesn't necessarily do much with that, and I don't think I have the space or place to answer as a Euro-American person about other people's beliefs and heritage. There are unfortunately a lot of archaeologists who do not take oral histories and things like that as seriously as they should, and they say, if there's no archaeological evidence, it's not true. I don't believe in that. I think oral histories are just as strong as what we claim to be archaeological evidence. So I err more on the side if people believe that's their heritage, I respect that and believe in that. That's my opinion, but every archaeologist you ask will have a different opinion on that.
Well, let's
Right.
thank
Thank you all.
Leslie.